Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be talking about how to build a competitive army from scratch. Building a competitive army with your own units sometimes isn't the easiest thing to do, especially if you don't have a lot of units, but you can always make a very strong list out of what you have. I remember back in 7th edition I came in 3rd in my first tournament ever by throwing together some random junk I had, but I played the army well and knew what each unit was meant to do. The same can be done with every army, and I'm going to teach you what to look for when building a list. First, you need to decide what army or armies you are going to play. I only say this because some people might own multiple armies, and I'm saying it because it's technically the first thing you have to consider when making a list. Second, you have to decide what type of list you are going to run. You have a few choices that are optimal for competitive, and they are Gunline, Alpha Strike, Horde, and Elite. Gunline armies normally stand still and benefit from character buffs to shoot their opponent to death. Armies that could do this would include the Imperial Guard and Space Marines. Alpha Strike lists are built to cripple the opponent on turn 1 by being insanely fast and having good firepower or combat power. Armies that can easily do this are Dark Eldar and Harlequins. Horde armies spam as many cheap models as possible to fill the board with units, and usually win a game by having too many bodies for the opponent to deal with. An example of Horde armies would be demons or orcs. Elite armies are armies that spam elite units that are very survivable depending on what your opponent has and if they have enough anti-tank to deal with them. Armies that can do this easily would be Imperial Knights and current Dark Angels. It should be noted that Gunline and Elite armies can also cripple their opponent on turn 1, but it usually only happens if there isn't enough terrain on the table or if the opponent deployed unoptimally. It should also be noted that most Alpha Strike armies are glass cannons, meaning they pack a very strong punch but will die to anything as strong as a slight breeze. Another thing to note is that these types of lists almost create a rock paper scissors type circle where gunlines counter hordes, elites counter gunlines, and hordes counter elites. So now that you know all of that, let's pick a list based off of your playstyle and your army's strengths. Don't try to make a Horde army out of Space Marines because it won't work. Your cheapest models are more expensive than most of the Orc models, so it really isn't made for that. If you need help figuring out what your army is good at because you're new or you just don't know, leave a comment down below and I'll help you when I can. Now I'm going to go through how to properly build each of those types of lists. For a gunline, you need to fulfill a couple of requirements to make a good gunline. You need objective holders and screening units, anti-infantry units, anti-tank units, and support units. The objective holders and screening units are whatever infantry your army has access to that are the cheapest. For Marines it would be Scouts, for Chaos it would be Cultists, for Orcs it would be Boys, and so on. Your anti-infantry is any weapon that is strength 5 to 7 with -1 to -3 AP and usually does 1 damage, although some stronger anti-infantry guns like autocannons do 2 damage. So an anti-infantry unit is anything that can carry that type of weapon. So for an example, we just stated autocannons are a decent anti-infantry weapon, so take a dreadnought and equip them with 2 autocannons. Anti-tank weapons would be any weapon that is strength 8, that has -2 to -5 AP, and does minimum D3 damage, but preferably you want the weapons that do D6 damage, since most vehicles have upwards of 10 wounds, so multi-damage weapons are great for taking them out. So an anti-tank unit is any unit that can fit anti-tank weapons on it. So for Marines it could be a Predator, a Dreadnought, or even Devastators. Support units are usually characters that give some kind of buff to the gunline. This could be a Space Marine Captain for Marines combined with a Lieutenant, or if you're Guard, then your order-giving units would be your support units. Any unit that buffs your gunline is a support unit, and gunlines usually do not work without them. The main reason gunline armies are so strong right now is because of all the characters that buff their army, like Azrael and Guilliman. If you are taking a heavy mechanized force, you can always take a Tech Marine or equivalent to heal up your vehicle. That would also count as a support unit. With that said, let's now discuss how much anti-tank and anti-infantry you need in your list. The answer to that question is entirely dependent on the type of meta you are going into. Are you playing in a local tournament or a larger tournament? If it's locals, then this should be pretty easy, because for the most part you should know who your competitors are and what they're going to be playing, because they're from your local gaming store and you most likely have played them once or twice. So if this is the case, then you can tailor your list to have as much anti-infantry or anti-tank as you need to kill their armies. If everyone in your club brings heavily mechanized lists, then spam some last cannons. If they bring mostly hordes, then spam anti-infantry. If you are unsure, then I always like to go 50-50 or 60-40 for my anti-tank and anti-infantry. That way you can deal with everything your opponent has. I always like to take slightly more anti-tank than anti-infantry because anti-tank are still okay at killing infantry, they just don't get as much bang for their buck. Whereas anti-infantry is not okay at killing tanks. So I would always rather have more anti-tank than anti-infantry, unless of course the meta dictates otherwise. As for events that will fall under the global meta instead of a local meta, you might have to prepare to face some of the really strong lists, and if you don't know what those are and want to keep up to date with the meta, then subscribe to my channel because I release the top 10 meta armies list every month to talk about what is currently doing good, so that would be a good way to stay on top of things. And so once you figure out what the global meta is, you adapt and build your list to counter that. I don't know if I said this earlier, but one of the biggest things to consider when building an army list is the fact that you want to counter as much as possible. In order to do that, you'll need to do a bit of research and find out what you'll be playing against. If you built a list that can counter every army you might face, then you have really good chances of winning. Moving on, let's talk about Alpha Strike lists. First thing I want to note, I don't think this type of list is going to be good in the coming months. More and more TOs are realizing you need a lot more terrain on the table, because a lack of terrain is one of the main reasons the meta shifted to Alpha Strike armies. So with that problem solved, and the fact that the guys that run the ITC created new missions for 8th that are being tested right now that are meant for countering Alpha Strikes, because Alpha Strikes are so deadly in 8th and everything dies so quick this edition. So keep in mind, Alpha Strike lists might not be viable in ITC events going forward, because it's not a fun style to play against for both players, and you want the game to be fun for everyone. So GW and the ITC are doing what they can to minimize the effectiveness of Alpha Strike armies. But with that said, if you still want to play an Alpha Strike army, make sure you have good and fast units that can hide on turn 1 and then pop out and shoot. A good example of this would be Dark Eldar with their Venoms. You can hide them very easily behind terrain and then fly over it on your turn to decimate your opponent. In Alpha Strike armies, you want to use that tactic, or a lot of Deep Strike to get into range to cripple your enemy on turn 1. I wouldn't recommend going with the Deep Strike route though, because people are slowly getting better at using screening units to deny Deep Strike space. If you want to learn more about that, check my tips and tricks video about Deep Strike denial. So like a gunline, you still need anti-tank and anti-infantry, but you don't necessarily need screening units because your army should be fast enough to hide and then attack. And also, if you don't get a good enough Alpha Strike off on turn 1, you're probably going to lose anyways. Alpha Strike lists are usually glass cannons, so they need to cripple the opponent, otherwise they will get torn to shreds. So because of this, you don't bring any screens and instead spam as many anti-tank and anti-infantry units as possible to get the biggest bang for your buck on turn 1 when you shoot. But again, remember, they must be fast and able to hide and then pop out and shoot, because if you go second, you can't afford to lose any of your firepower or else your Alpha Strike potential drops significantly, meaning you will most likely lose the game. This type of army is extremely high risk, high reward, and with the changes the ITC and GW are making, I don't think Alpha Strike lists are going to last very much longer. Now let's talk about Hordes. Hordes are very simple in what they do. They usually are melee, and they corner their opponent with many models so that they maintain board control for the whole game or the majority of the game. If you push your opponent into a corner, they can't grab objectives. So when you push them into a corner, you stand on all the objectives. Unless you're doing extremely well, you will most likely end the game with less units than your opponent, but will have more points based off of the board control you maintained throughout the game. You don't necessarily need any anti-tank in this type of army, because you mainly just want to tie up their vehicles so they can't shoot, which means they're pretty much as good as dead anyways. So use all your points on spamming the cheapest but most efficient models you have possible, and just run at your opponent and force them into a corner so you can take board control. This is probably one of the easiest armies to win with if you understand some tricks in tying up units in close combat. If you need any advice on how to do that, I have a few tips and tricks videos that can teach you some things about how to tie up vehicles in close combat. The last type of army to talk about are elite armies. Elite armies are armies that consist of a few very strong models. An example would be an Imperial Knight army, or a Dark Angels list that spams dreadnoughts. You essentially bring an army like this to counter all of the anti-infantry people are bringing and making all their anti-infantry useless. The main advantage of an elite list is to hope your opponent has more anti-infantry than anti-tank, so your stuff won't die as easily. You can use infantry in elite lists, but I would only recommend using models that have 3+ wounds on them, so paladins from Grey Knights or Imperial Custodes. The biggest downside to this type of army is that you don't have any cheap units, meaning every time something dies, you lose a good chunk of your army. So sometimes it's good to combine an elite army with a small horde army to screen for them. This army though still has to pay attention to the amount of anti-tank and anti-infantry it has, because like a gunline army, its main goal is to kill the opponent, since it will have a harder time getting on objectives because of the low model count and the fact that every battle-forged army now has objective secured. Meaning if they have one conscript on the objective you want, that conscript is getting that objective. So the goal is to kill your opponent with this type of army. So I think that about covers it for the different type of lists you can make and what type of units to throw in them. Remember, not everyone in your local meta is going to have fully optimal lists yet, because the game is still fairly new, and because models are expensive, so they most likely haven't had the chance to make fully optimal lists like yourself. So just take what you have available, but work with what I talked about in this video, and remember the way the meta counters itself. Gunlines beat hordes, elites beat gunline, horde beats elite. That doesn't mean a horde army can't beat a gunline, it's just not as easy as beating elites. Another thing to remember and take into consideration is always try to take the units that give you the most bang for your buck. So for example, if you want to screen and you're playing Space Marines, I would take scouts over your tacticals, because your screen is just meant to die anyways. So you can fit way more scouts into your list than you can tactical Marines because they're cheaper. Another thing to remember too is scouts hold the same weapons as Marines. So sure, they don't have as good of an armor save or whatever, but if you go first, you're still getting the same amount of shots off at the same ballistic skill. So try to always take the cheapest but most effective units for their points cost. So another good example, if you want the reroll ones for a Chaos army, take a Chaos Lord instead of a Demon Prince. Unless of course you want to use the Demon Prince to run up the board and go smack stuff. But if you're just using them to sit back in a gunline, then a Chaos Lord bare bones with a chainsword and pistol is the way to go, because then you can fit more points into anti-infantry, anti-tank, and whatever else you need. The point is, you always try to get the best bang for your buck off of points. If there's a unit that does what your unit does better, but it's cheaper, then you take the cheaper unit. Unless, of course, you don't have the models and you're just making a list out of whatever you can, then just take whatever you have available to you that works the best and is the cheapest and will give you the most bang for your buck. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below and I'll get to you when I can. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe for more if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy wargaming!